Hello, everybody. It's me again, V, White Zulu, and I hope you're enjoying these excerpts from my autobiography of the same name, White Zulu. And I left you with chapter 11 in the middle of the arrival of the Zulu witch doctor on the farm, which had caused quite a buzz. And this is White Zulu, chapter 12, Witch Doctors and Zulu Folklore. There wasn't a soul about. I'll find somebody, I replied to the witch doctor, and ran into Kupane's hut. I suspected I'd find him in there. He was cowering under his parents' bed, with just the whites of his eyes visible in the gloom. I noticed that the legs of their bed were also set up on bricks to keep the tokolosh away. Kupane, I hissed. What's going on? What are you doing? That's the witch doctor, he whispered back, his teeth chattering with fright. Tell her nobody's here. I'd never seen him this frightened before. I peered at him closely. His face was beaded with sweat, and his skin had a greyish pallor. Then I remembered what Evelyn had said about a witch doctor arriving on the farm. Somebody called the Sangoma to come here, I said to Kupane in a whisper. I could smell his fear, a pungent, musky, almost polecat-like aroma coming off him. We can't send her away. I'm not going out there, he hissed emphatically. And I realized that I would have to drag him bodily, probably screaming out of his bolt hole, if I wanted him to deal with this situation. Stay there then, you coward, and I'll go and call Evelina. I ran back to the oddly dressed woman and asked her politely to wait while I fetched someone. Then I trotted back past the stables and sheds to the house. Evelina was kneeling on a piece of sheepskin in the sitting room, polishing the crystal knob of the door which led to the dining room. The Sangoma's here, I said quietly in her ear in Zulu. She froze. The soft cloth dropped out of her hand and onto the floor, and her eyes widened, the whites showing as they swiveled about in terror. Where? She gasped. I noticed that she too had beads of sweat, which suddenly appeared on her brow and top lip. Her skin was going grey like Kupane's. She's up at the huts, I said. She's waiting up there and I can't find anybody. I can't leave my work. Nkosikazi would be very angry. What shall I do? She remained where she was, still on her knees, a middle-aged mother and possibly grandmother, torn between her fear of the witch doctor and that of my mother. Go and tell Mackay. He's up at the back chopping firewood. He'll be able to slip away and go and greet her. I did as I was told and then stood in the road as I watched Mackay hurry nervously up the path towards their huts. The Zulus would never have involved me in whatever transpired, and for the remainder of these proceedings were a closed door. I knew very little about this witchcraft business as a child. Later on in my life, I did turn to witch doctors for help, very successfully, I might add. Incidents in our daily lives regularly revealed themselves as mtagati, a witch doctor who casts evil spells, or one of his own spells. For instance, when we had boiled or fried eggs, and Evelina saw a minute blood clot, as often appears in eggs, she'd fuss in Zulu and very carefully scrape the offending particle out with a spoon. And then she'd go and throw it out of the window very quickly, muttering to herself. Zulus believe that's a sign that somebody's put a spell on the intended egg eater. She would have thrown the whole egg away, I know, if she hadn't been so afraid of my mother. Chameleons, too, threw them all into a state of sheer terror, and we could achieve some satisfying results by walking casually up to anybody on the farm and suddenly thrusting a hand out to show them a live chameleon clinging there with its tail wrapped around one of our fingers. If the startled creature opened its mouth to hiss, it showed a bright orange interior where its tongue lay coiled, and this could produce an actual fit among the women. "It'll bite you and you'll die," they pleaded. "Unwabu is venomous." Frogs and toads produced a similar reaction, although not quite as dramatic. Zulus believe that chameleons, toads, and frogs are all as deadly as snakes, if not more so. The Zulus believe implicitly that they carry venom and can strike just like any snake. The latter, on the other hand, caused an excited shout of "Inyoga, snake," whenever one was seen slithering around or lying in wait, as puff adders do, and everybody gathered around to kill it. Finally, an argument usually arose as to whom would claim it as theirs to use for muti. It seems that one could apply snake fat and the oil to one's joints to reduce pain and arthritis, and that qualified as a muti, or medicine, but without the terror associated with witchcraft. Zulu folklore and friends. One day we were sitting next to where the washing and ironing women hung our laundry out to dry on a sagging wire line strung between two wonky poles. Our sheets, which were too big to hang up, were draped over the shaggy kikuyu grass along the path. Minute red ticks climbed into the warm, damp seams and settled there until the sheets were back on our beds, when they crept out again to lodge their mandibles into our warm flesh. For years and years, we all suffered from hundreds of tiny itching bites around our pulse points, until our GP asked my father, when his bites had gone septic and turned into a huge abscess, "Where do your servants dry your laundry?" And he had explained about the ticks. So my mother had rather grudgingly arranged for Jomela to put up another couple of lines for our sheets. It was bliss to be able to get into bed after our baths without itching so badly that I sometimes scratched my ankles raw. Oddly enough, ticks never seemed to bother my mother much. Reading a book about war last night, I said to Evelina, as we sat in the shade of the gum trees. I didn't know the Zulu word for war, so I used the English word. What is this thing, war? She asked, two vertical lines wrinkling her gleaming brown forehead in puzzlement, as she threaded a long line of tiny scarlet-coloured beads onto a piece of cotton with an embroidery needle. It's when two countries fight over some land, I think, I said uncertainly. Anyway, I was reading this book called The Great Escape about prisoners of war. What a pleesnos! She carefully tied a knot in the thread and began picking up some yellow beads with her needle. A prisoner is when a man gets caught by others. They put him in a place where he can't escape, and they keep him there for years even, and they give him very little food, I expanded, warming to my subject. I was 5 years old. Why? Interrupted Evelina. We Zulus don't do that. When we catch a man who's done something wrong, we kill him, she said, biting off the thread, her strong white teeth making a sharp snap. Then she turned her beadwork over in her pink palms, inspecting with satisfaction the small square of red, yellow, green, and blue beads woven intricate pattern. She was making an ubeshu, a little modesty panel worn by Zulu maidens, over the ngutu, the private parts, for one of her young daughters. Oh, did you kill them all? I asked, surprised at this revelation. Why? Evelina put the ubeshu down on her lap and leaned her back against the warm trunk of the gum tree. Its bark hung down in strips like peeling wallpaper to reveal the smooth, delicate, pinkish grey-green skin underneath. Pungent eucalyptus leaves rustled dryly overhead in the hot breeze, which meandered through the valley at this time of the afternoon. The rest of the farm lay in its usual soporific state, while everybody slept through the worst of the heat. The Christmas beetles were the only creatures which made any noise, as they screamed incessantly. Well now, if a man steals something from a member of the tribe, or hurts somebody for no good reason, he's brought before the chief, who, with the other elders, questions him. If he won't speak, they'll fetch the sangoma, the healer, or even umtagati, the witch doctor who casts evil spells. She stopped speaking and shuddered for a moment, disturbed by the very thought. The witch doctor puts a curse on the man so that he has to tell the council all his wrongdoings. And the chief then speaks to his elders, and they hold an indaba and decide whether they should punish him or not. If the crime is not a bad one, they let the man go, making sure he's very frightened. But if it's a serious one, they put him to death. Nduna tells one of his warriors to run a spear through his heart. Or sometimes they throw him off a cliff to his death, like King Shaka used to do with his enemies in my great-grandfather's day, continued Evelina. We called it the umfekani. Isn't that very cruel? I asked, my eyes big with alarm. No, said Evelina emphatically. That means the end of the problem. Just think about it. If the tribe has to keep a man prisoner, they would have to first dig a very deep pit, one with very steep sides that he cannot climb out of and run away. Then somebody, a woman, has to cook food for him and take it to him 3 times a day. She also has to take away his waste. She pulled down her mouth and shook her head at the thought. It would be a drain on the strength of the tribe, especially as you know, every few months we have to move on to find better grazing and game. If the prisoner does manage to escape, he will have a grudge against his people forever, and he will be a very dangerous man. No, it's better that he's put to death straight away. It's the same with old people, she continued, those who are too weak to help gather food or hunt. When they can no longer walk or cook or even collect firewood, we carry them out beyond the boma, the thorn enclosure, out to where the hyenas will take them during the night. Evelina sat there for a moment, deep in thought, and then with one hand picked up her obeshu again, and with the other she began scratching around in her rush basket for another packet of beads. Every member of a Zulu tribe has to serve a purpose, she said, holding a cellophane bag of white beads up to the light and scrutinizing it through narrowed eyes. She then selected a handful and began to thread them carefully onto her needle and cotton. They have to be able to move on with the others to new hunting grounds and bring food back to the huts. If they can't, then they are useless and make the tribe vulnerable, having to stay behind to look after them. The weak and frail have to be dispatched. Sick people, very old people, and even babies get taken out beyond the boma as night falls. Babies? I exclaimed in horror. Why babies? I sat up from the soft tuft of kikuyu grass where I'd been lying, forgetting that I was almost certainly attracting those tiny red pepper ticks which lurked on its blades, just waiting for such an opportunity. Twin babies, explained Evelina impassively. If a woman gives birth to twins, the tribe sees it as a curse put on her by Umtagati. They'll take away the smaller or weaker baby, wrap it in a grass mat, and leave it out beyond the boma for the night predators like hyenas to take away. I wriggled uneasily on the grass tussock, and it was not from the thought of ticks crawling into my brooks. That explained why I'd never seen twins among the numerous Zulu children I played with every day. I had twin cousins, though, whom I met now and again at polo tournaments, a boy and a girl about 2 years younger than I was. Wow, I thought, imagine if they'd been Zulus. What if the mother of the twins wanted to keep both babies? I asked, perplexed. Could she hide one of her babies and say she'd only had one? How? No, explained Evelina. The mother of those twins would be as frightened as the rest of the tribe. And anyway, how could she hide a baby away forever? The people would soon find it. Come now, the sun is getting low in the sky. It's getting on for your bath time. We must see if you've picked up any ticks where you've been sitting in that long grass. She packed away her beadwork and heaved herself to her feet, brushing dust off the seat of her navy uniform skirt with both hands. I followed her down the narrow earth path carved over the years by the bare feet of so many of our workers, the washwoman, Masangu when he walked up to the chicken run to fetch a fowl for lunch, Mackay who fed the fowls and then put them to bed each night, secure behind strong wire netting in the corrugated iron hut, so that they would be safe from janets and water mongoose who could slip in through the tiniest hole in a wire cage and kill the lot. Another of my best friends was our Induna, Robert Ngiti, who had led an almost parallel life to Dad's. Robert arrived at New Forest in 1925, when Dad's parents moved across from their branch, Beverley in the Dargle, about 15 miles away. His father was Grandpa's Induna at Beverley and naturally came across to New Forest with his wives and children, including Robert, who was 10 at the time, the same age as Dad. The two boys became close friends and playmates. There was none of the peculiar snobbery which made Mum insist that we girls never play with Mont children. Dad and Robert spent all their time together until Dad went to boarding school at King's School in Nottingham Road, and then a couple of years later on to Michael House at Belgowan, about 30 miles away from the farm. They continued to play together during the school holidays, though, although Robert and Ngiti must have gone back to Mbandla at some stage during those years, as he had had some schooling, was able to read and write, and thus passed his driving test in Moy River. After the Second World War, when Dad came home to live at the New Forest with his new bride, Ngiti Sr. retired. Robert took over his place as the head boy on the farm, and, like Mum and Dad, he produced 4 daughters. He never had a son, just these 4 girls. Of course, Ngiti was delighted as each new girl arrived, as it meant he would receive many head of good cattle as ulubola, and each birth was a cause for rejoicing, rather the opposite of what was happening in the big farmhouse 500 yards away. When Mum and Dad received the news of the gender of each of their children with such dismay. Ngiti had his own hut, bigger than any of the others, except the Uputu Kaya, the dormitory accommodation for bachelor farm labourers, which was a long, oblong thatched hut with several doors. His hut was round like the others, but bigger. His most senior wife lived with him, but none of his daughters. They lived with the rest of his other wives in Mbandla and had some sort of schooling, as Ngiti earned a better salary than the rest of our Zulus, being in charge of them. Raki went upwards from him to the white manager, and then to Dad, who had to finally settle disputes or make the most crucial decisions. All the farm staff liked and respected their Induna, Ngiti, immensely, and he was a valuable asset to the smooth running of the farm. His wife kept a hawk with some fowls, and had a flourishing veggie patch growing pumpkin, sorghum, potato. Sorghum is maltabella, potato and mealies. To Mum's disgust, the baboons never went near Ngiti's vegetables. That was because wisely his wife used to hire an umfaan for pocket money of a few pennies a day to spend the day throwing sticks or stones at them to keep them away. A solution which Dad had suggested to Mum when the problem of baboons trashing her garden first arose, and which she greeted with a snort of disgust and the comment, "I don't want any idle umfaans around getting up to mischief." And so the baboons regularly laid waste to her veggie and flower gardens for the best part of 60 years. To add insult to injury, Ngiti's wife used to bring a big woven basket filled with prize vegetables over to Mum as a gift now and again. Ngiti also ran some cattle, ulubola, for any more wives he might want, with Dad's herd, and had them dipped and inoculated at no cost to himself, other than all the effort he put into running the farm efficiently for Dad. Ngiti was, as was only proper in a chief, quite portly, with a big belly. He ferried the labourers around in our old jeep, carted winter supplement feed for the stock, and oversaw everything. He was the intermediary between the staff and the white farm manager. Mr. Bannatyne, our farm manager, was the buffer between Dad and his induna. Our Zulus hated the former with a deadly loathing. They called him umdloloti, which means cattle tulip, an indigenous poisonous species of lily, toxic and deadly to cattle, and watched him warily as he strutted around among them, giving orders by gesticulating with the short-handled, long rimpi whip he always carried in his right hand, his cruel little red eyes constantly darting around to see what trouble he could nip in the bud. When Robert Ngiti gained his driving license, Dad had an immaculate white chauffeur's coat and white cap like yachtsmen wear, with a shiny black peak sent up for him from W.G. Brown's, his father's trading company, to wear, his grandfather's trading company, to wear on special occasions. Otherwise, Ngiti drove the jeep and trailer all over the farm, wearing faded denim bib overalls. When, for a year, all four of us were at St. Anne's Prep and College at Hilton Road, Ngiti would drive the enormous Pontiac, back seat and boot filled with our 4 school trunks over the day before, so there would be enough room for Mum and the 4 of us, plus our own small overnight cases, in the car the following day, when she took us herself. When the time came for us to get married, Ngiti proudly drove Dad and each bride to the church, the car beribboned with white satin, and Ngiti sitting majestically at the wheel in his smart chauffeur's uniform. He beamed back at the waving crowds of Zulus who screamed, "Makoti, bride," as the car sailed by, his broad smile revealing about half a dozen rickety-looking teeth, higgledy-piggledy in his shining pink gums. When we girls had married and left home, and the time came for Robert and Geety to retire, he left the farm to live out his days in his hut, in his kraal in Mbandla. He had plenty of wives to look after him, and no shortage of daughters either to do the same. As he and his wife could live for nothing at New Forest, because there was such an abundance of food, blankets, gumboots and overalls, and because he'd received a good salary as in Duna, all his money was intact. So Ngiti had been able to save almost all his salary to pay for his daughters to have an education, and they became teachers and nurses and clerks. They, in turn, were able to support their parents in a comfortable retirement. If only Dad had been similarly enlightened, things would have turned out for him as well as they did for old Ngiti. Ella, another of my dearest friends, had spent nearly all of his life herding sheep and cattle at the top of the farm. He had a hut in the shelter of a clump of old gum trees on the ridge of the escarpment, which divided the top farm from the rest of the valley. It was built from corrugated iron and had several sheep pens surrounding it in which kikuyu grass grew in lush profusion as additional grazing for any sick or lame animals, which he rounded up on horseback and brought in for treatment. He had a bony, shaggy old Basutu pony, which he rode over the veld all summer long, while he checked on the stock, and occasionally he rode down into the valley to report losses to Dad or the manager. Back Jackal took the opportunity during the lambing season to snatch the odd lamb when they were casting about, competing with our big pitch black and noisily vocal African crows for the placentas they felt were rightfully theirs. If jackals became too numerous and posed a real problem, Dad sent a message for the jackal pack. This was vermin control in the form of a Zulu hunter and his pack of toast-ribbed curs, Izigodoi, who arrived at the back gate amid a frenzy of barking and snarling from our own dogs, who had to be shut up in the dairy while a transaction went on between Dad and the jackal man. The state offered a bounty of 15 rand on each tail which could be produced at the Nottingham Road police station. I expect that Dad offered another small sum over and above the bounty fee, a ration of uputu and our plentiful skimmed milk for the hunter and his dogs, and free run of the farm until jackal numbers were reduced to an acceptable level. I was horrified at the sight of so many undernourished and desperate-looking dogs. I hated the way they cringed around their master's legs, lips curled ingratiatingly, skinny tails tucked under their concave bellies, and the way they shivered when our sleek, well-fed pointers, Radar and Rufus, bayed at them. Of course, I followed at a safe distance to sit on the bank to watch the jackal hunter make his preparations. When he'd received his ration, a big bucket of uputu from our cookwoman, he asked for a wheelbarrow. He tipped a portion of uputu from self into a billy can which he kept in a sack he had slung over his shoulder, and the rest into the filthy wheelbarrow. The cook woman brought him the same bucket filled with separated milk, and he poured some into an empty whiskey bottle from his sack for his tea, and the rest on top of the uputu in the wheelbarrow. Then he stood back, and the pack of about 15 dogs fell on the food, wolfing down uputu and milk in great choking gulps. I'd never seen starving animals before, and I felt ashamed at my disgust as I watched these creatures eating for their very lives. The jackal skins were lovely, black and tan and white, and I would have loved one for my very own to put at the foot of my bed. But the hunter shook his head and said he could sell them for good money in Umtuleni, Nottingham Road. During the winter, Jomela and the stock came down into the valley to spend the short 2 to 3 months season, safe from the sudden snowfalls which fell each year and covered the top of the farm, painting it white as far as the eye could see, joining our farm to the Drakensberg Mountains, which were already snow-covered from April onwards. Jomela lived down in the valley now. The 5,000 head of sheep had long ago been sold, as wool prices plummeted in the 1960s after the invention of cheaper synthetic substitutes such as acrylics and polyester, and now somebody else herded cattle up on top. He was enlisted as a spare on Mum's team of gardening women. He washed both the cows and the Land Rover every morning, although Dad often got into the car and said dryly, "Jomela's given it a Jewish wash. He's only cleaned all the bits I can see from the driver's seat." Jomela also did most of the watering and various other small jobs, which younger Zulu women and girls thought were beneath their dignity and more suited to withered old men. Picking up after the baboons was one of them. It meant replanting the potato or pumpkin vines torn up by them, or trudging up the hill behind the house to replace the water pipes they'd pulled up, leaving our supply to trickle impotently into the soil, which the baboons had grubbed through looking for songololos instead of into the reservoir. That's all for this time. I will follow through with some more next time I make a video. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'm certainly enjoying reading them. And I want to thank John Moslane very much for helping me do these videos, as he is effectively my sound engineer, as I call him. Without him, I couldn't put these out. And I'd also love it if you could visit my website, www.whitezulubook.com, where you'll see plenty of photographs and more information there. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.